Our text for this morning's sermon is Genesis 40. Genesis 40. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in his custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand, but he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. The grass withers and the flower fades, but surely the word of our God stands firm and sure forevermore. Well, loved ones, as we turn the page and begin to consider this next chapter in the story of Joseph's life, we discover that Joseph's circumstances haven't changed at all from what they were in chapter 39, which means that Joseph continued to be a prisoner in an Egyptian jail. Now, we have come to learn something about the circumstances of Joseph's confinement. So we've learned, for instance, about how Joseph had come to be a prisoner. And so we know that Joseph had experienced a stunning reversal of fortune, one that was occasioned by a false charge that had been brought against him by his master's wife. And that means that we know that Joseph has been imprisoned as a consequence of a great injustice. Of course, we have also learned about the determination that Joseph made while he languished in captivity. So we've learned that Joseph had chosen to make the best of his circumstances. In fact, what we've learned is that Joseph had committed himself to behaving in the prison house in exactly the same manner that he had behaved in Potiphar's house, which is to say that he had committed himself to being a model prisoner and to being a committed servant. And that, we are told, is something that the Lord blessed. Because Moses tells us that the Lord enabled Joseph to maintain that commitment. More than that, under the Lord's blessing, Joseph became such an indispensable servant to the jailer that he actually ends up being put in charge of the day-to-day operations of the prison. But most importantly, we have learned about the hope that sustained Joseph during the darkness of those prison years. Now, we know that Joseph had actually been supplied with that hope many years ago. It was a hope that he had received when, as a young man in his father's house, he had dreamed dreams. These dreams which had come to him from the Lord, and these dreams which had spoken to him about a coming day when he would be honored in the midst of his family. Now, those dreams, they had been the word of the Lord to Joseph, and Joseph had clung to them. He'd clung to that revelation in hope, and in that hope, he had committed himself to a life of faithful service, even as he waited for the promised fulfillment of those dreams. But hope is a tricky thing, isn't it? Because on the one hand, hope is what keeps us going. And you can imagine that for Joseph, the knowledge that God had plans for him, plans that involved lifting him up and raising him up to a place of honor in the midst of his family. Well, that hope and that understanding, that would have been the only thing that kept him going during those prison years. And yet, even as he waited and worked, Joseph must also have wondered, how is God going to keep those promises? How would he fulfill those promises of exaltation and reunification if Joseph was in prison? And you can imagine Joseph thinking to himself, but I'm not with my family, and this certainly isn't a place of honor. And so how is God going to make good on those promises? You can imagine that even as Joseph waited and hoped, he must have wondered, how am I going to get out of this place? And because waiting is never easy, even for the faithful child of God, as one day faded into the next and no way of redress, no way of escape presented itself, Joseph must have often felt as if his hopes were being dashed. And since he was both a foreigner and a slave, Joseph would have understood that with every passing day, there would have been less and less reason for anyone to remember him or to care about his plight. Joseph understood that he was a nobody. And because he was a nobody, there wasn't going to be anybody who would have had any real motivation for taking up his cause. And it's not hard to imagine that in the midst of his circumstances, Joseph must have uttered cries that were similar to those offered up by the psalmist in Psalm 13. I think particularly of Psalm 13, verse 1, where the psalmist says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemies be exalted over me?" And you can imagine Joseph crying out to the Lord, "How long until my dreams have come true? How long until they're fulfilled?" Now, while Joseph was no doubt struggling to understand why his hope was being so sorely tested, we have been told the reason for his trials. And so we know something that Joseph didn't. We know that God was at work sanctifying his servant. And we know that God was doing this as a way of preparing Joseph to fulfill the work that God had ordained for him, that work of saving his family, not just physically in the famine, but saving his family by reuniting them together in love. And our text makes it clear that God's sanctifying work, it was bearing fruit in Joseph's life. We find evidence of that fruit in Joseph's continued trust in the Lord. And we've seen that Joseph lived out that trust in his commitment not to give his heart over to bitterness, not to give his heart over to self-pity and woe. But the fruit of God's sanctifying work wasn't just found inside of Joseph's heart. It was also fruit that could be found in his life. And we see that fruit evidenced in Joseph's remarkable expression of love for his neighbors. You know, here's the thing. When you and I find ourselves enduring a time of suffering or trial, it can often be the case that we become very narrowly focused on the misery of our own circumstances. And when that happens, we don't tend to have much of an eye for the struggles of others. Mercifully, however, that wasn't the case for Joseph, because even in the midst of his own suffering, Joseph showed a genuine care and concern for the people who were in his charge. And we see that in the way that Joseph responds to the distress of the two men who have been incarcerated with him in Pharaoh's jail. Now, if we think about these two men for a minute, we do need to understand that they did differ from Joseph in one very important fashion. These men who'd been put in jail alongside Joseph, they weren't nobodies. And we know that because they were senior officials within Pharaoh's royal court. Now, you might wonder about that. You might wonder why I would speak about a cupbearer and a baker as being such important people. Those don't actually sound like particularly important or significant jobs. But here is the thing about the position that these two men held. These were tasks, these were occupations that ensured that they had daily connection to the king. They were daily in contact with Pharaoh. They had access to the king. And the thing about being a king in the ancient world is that kings in the ancient world, they weren't rulers so much by right as they were rulers by might. And ancient kings and queens, they always lived in fear that they might be overthrown by someone who was stronger than they were, someone who was more ruthless than they were. And because of that fear, any ancient ruler, they took great care to guard access to their person, and that included taking great care to watch what they ate. And the point here is that the people who served them their food, they had to be people in whom the king or the queen had an absolute trust, because these were people who could most easily harm them if they were given the right motivation or incentive. And so the cupbearer, the baker, these were people who occupied very important, very trusted positions within Pharaoh's court. The reality is then, from what we are told in this passage, it seems that Pharaoh had come to the conclusion that something smelled in his court, that some business was afoot, and that these two men couldn't be trusted to have his best interests at heart. And so Pharaoh has these men arrested, and he has them taken, and he has them thrown into captivity in the very jail in which Joseph had been given charge. Now, just a brief word about this jail for a moment. Along the way, as we have been talking about Joseph's circumstances, we've been speaking about how Joseph was imprisoned. The thing is, that isn't actually the case, because Joseph wasn't actually imprisoned. What had happened to Joseph is that he had been jailed. And there is actually an important distinction between those two conditions. You see, jail, that is a place where people are held while the authorities decide how to render justice upon them. But prison is a place where people are sent after justice has been rendered. And I just want to give you an example of this. Here in Hamilton, we have a jail, right? There's the Barton Street Jail. Now, if you end up in that jail, then you are placed there because a determination has not been made about your legal status. Justice has not yet been rendered, and you may wait in jail until such time as that occurs. But once justice has been rendered, you may find that you are sent to a different institution, an institution like we find in Kingston, for instance. And so there's a distinction between being in jail and a distinction between being in prison. And in the ancient world, there really weren't prisons. And that's because none of the ancient kings really had the financial resources to actually be able to build and manage a prison. And I'll note here just quickly that prisons, at least in the way that we don't understand them, they don't actually come into existence until the modern era. Now, I want you to appreciate this distinction because it helps to inform our understanding of this passage in two very important ways. First of all, it really helps to deepen our understanding of Joseph's suffering and the strain that was being placed on his hope. Because remember, Joseph wasn't in prison, Joseph was in jail. And jails were places that you weren't supposed to remain in. Jails were places you weren't supposed to get stuck in. No, the reality is you went to jail as the process of justice and judgment worked itself out. But Joseph hasn't been able to participate in that process. Joseph is in a position where justice has been denied to him. Joseph is in a set of circumstances where he's been stuffed into jail and he's been forgotten about. And the fact that his experience of remaining stuck in jail was so unexpected and so unique, well, that's something that would have only compounded the nature and the scope of Joseph's frustration and suffering. He knew this was a jail, and so he hadn't expected to be stuck there. Beyond that, however, we are now in a position to appreciate what was happening in the lives of the cupbearer and the baker, because these were men who were living in an immediate expectation of judgment. And they would have known that beyond those jailhouse walls, decisions were being made. Decisions were being made about their future. And these men, they would have known that those decisions would have been very consequential ones. And that is why they're so distressed. That's why they're so distressed by their dreams. Because those dreams that they received, they would have understood them as having a divine source. They would have understood that those dreams had come to them, not from men, but in their minds, from the gods. And that would have alerted them to the fact that their lives had become bound up in the unfolding of some heavenly plan of affairs. And that would have confirmed for them that one way or another, justice was coming. They would have known that. And that's why when they receive these dreams, they're so very distressed. And Joseph's whose heart is being shaped and molded by the sanctifying power of God, Joseph is mercifully attuned to their distress. Because Joseph's heart wasn't fixated on the matter of his own affliction, he has a care for them. And when he sees that they're distressed, Joseph steps in and he asks them, "What can I do for you? How can I comfort you? In what way can I be of assistance? How can I help to alleviate this distress?" And presumably these two men who sense the sincerity of Joseph's concern, these two men tell Joseph that they had dreamed dreams. And you can practically feel it through the page, can't you? You can practically feel the heart that must have skipped a beat. You can practically sense the eyes that must have come alight as Joseph heard about those dreams. Because dreams, that was something that Joseph knew a thing or two about. And the single most important thing that Joseph knew about dreams is that dreams come from the Lord. And you can practically feel Joseph's excitement, can't you? Because surely Joseph must have thought to himself in the moment that he heard about those dreams, this is it. This is it. God is at work here. God is pulling the levers. And that must mean that this is the beginning of the end. It must mean that this is the way that I am getting out of here. And that's clear from the way that he responds to these men. These men who know that their dreams are important, these men who understand that these dreams signify their judgment, but who don't know how or why that will be. And Joseph says to them, don't you know that both dreams and their interpretation are things that belong to the Lord? Joseph then, he saw the hand of the Lord at work in these events. And having come to that conclusion, he must have been certain that this was the way that he was going to be released. This was the way that he would be set free. Now, we don't know how it was that God communicated the interpretation of these dreams to Joseph. But we do know that when Joseph had heard the details of each man's dream, that he was able to provide a clear and a decisive interpretation of what they had seen. And so he promptly informs the cupbearer that his dream portended the return of Pharaoh's favor, and he tells him that he is going to be brought back into Pharaoh's service. He says, in 3 days you'll be back in Pharaoh's court, Pharaoh's cup will be in your hand, and you're going to be putting it in his hand. And with that same alacrity, he informs the baker that his fate was going to be altogether different. And he tells the baker that he too is going to be lifted up, but he's going to be lifted up by the neck because he is going to fall under Pharaoh's wrath and judgment. And let's just pause here for a moment, brothers and sisters. Let's pause here for a moment to reflect on the way that Joseph communicated that information. And what is important here is that Joseph had a truthful message to bring to each of these men, and Joseph did not shy away from delivering that message, even when he had to speak a hard word to one of them. And there's wisdom for us here. And there's not just wisdom for us in seeing how Joseph conveys this information, there's encouragement as well. Because you and I, as believers, we find ourselves in that same position, don't we? We find ourselves in the position of having to communicate a word from God to our neighbors. That word that we have been tasked with communicating is the message of the gospel. And it's a word that is very much a double-edged sword. That's because for some people, the word of the gospel, well, it's going to be a word of comfort. Because they will hear about God's determination to show mercy to sinners. But for others, that same word of the gospel will be a hard word. It will be a hard word as they are told about how God is going to come in judgment. How he's going to come in judgment against their rebellion and how he's going to come in judgment against their sin. But just like Joseph, we ought never to shrink from speaking that truth, even if it means telling people who have clearly set their hearts against King Jesus that their rebellion is not going to be allowed to continue, nor will it be allowed to go unpunished. Rather, like Joseph, we ought always to speak the truth in the context of a sincere expression of love for our neighbors, even when that means uttering a hard word of judgment against their iniquity. As we proclaim the word of God that has been given to us, let's keep Joseph's example in mind. This is how to speak the gospel. This is how to share the truth in love. But back to Joseph. Joseph, who must have thought that this was the way out for him. And again, we know that this is exactly what Joseph is thinking because of what he says to the cupbearer. He says to that man, don't forget about me. Don't forget about my kindness. Don't forget about what I've done for you, but make sure you remember me to Pharaoh when you are back in his house. Now, why would Joseph have been so insistent about that? Why would he have imagined that hearing about what he had done in this jail cell, that this was something that could set him free, that this was something that could affect his circumstances so greatly? Well, first of all, notice how Joseph points out that he is in this situation because he has been unjustly accused. So what he is hoping is that Pharaoh, that when he heard about what Joseph had done and that he heard about how long Joseph had been in that jail, that he would be prepared to conduct an investigation into Joseph's circumstances. And the key here is that Joseph, he's not just hoping that this investigation will testify of his innocence in terms of his relationship with Potiphar and his wife. What Joseph is hoping is that this investigation will testify of his faithfulness as a servant. And Joseph understood that as a ruler, that Pharaoh was always in the market for a few good men, particularly since his current housing situation was down by one member. Joseph is hoping that Pharaoh will hear of how faithfully he labored in Potiphar's household and what a blessing that had been, and that understanding might move Pharaoh to consider his circumstances. And in connection with that, if the cupbearer remembered to tell Pharaoh about how Joseph had successfully interpreted his dreams, then Joseph is counting on the fact that this would trigger, if not Pharaoh's sense of judgment, then at least Pharaoh's sense of self-interest. And why is that? Because no king in the ancient world, no ruler in the ancient world, could imagine having a more valuable and useful servant than a man or a woman who was capable of interpreting dreams. And that is because in the ancient world, dreams were understood to be a message from the gods. And every king wanted to know what the gods were thinking and planning. Just think of all the examples in the Old Testament of Old Testament kings who tried to seek out the will of their gods in various circumstances. They offered sacrifices, they made offerings, they turned to oracles. Time and time again, ancient rulers appealed to men and women who they believed had the power to interpret dreams as a way of securing and understanding the favor of the gods. And so Joseph is hoping that when Pharaoh hears about what he has done, that Pharaoh will think, well, that guy is literally worth his weight in gold. And I may not care about the justice of his circumstances, but I sure do care about how he could be useful to me. He's counting on Pharaoh to seek after his own enrichment. And finally, take note of the fact of the day on which the cupbearer's restoration occurred. We're told here that this was the day of Pharaoh's birthday. Now, when it came to their birthdays, ancient rulers were a little bit like hobbits. And they were like hobbits in the sense that ancient kings used their birthday celebrations as an occasion to give gifts to others. Now, they didn't do that because they cared about the welfare of the people that they were giving the gifts to. They did this as a kind of public relations opportunity. Their birthday was an opportunity which allowed them to present themselves as being generous and merciful rulers. And Joseph was no doubt hoping that Pharaoh might take the opportunity of his birthday to display his benevolence by setting a prisoner free. We see a parallel to this later in the New Testament when Pilate offers to release Barabbas. He did so according to custom. How do you keep a subjugated people quiet? Well, occasionally you throw them a bone. You release a prisoner. You show that you're a merciful ruler. Joseph is counting on Pharaoh having that same attitude around his birthday. This will be a public relations opportunity to show what a good guy he is. And all of these reasons are why Joseph was so insistent. This is why he implores that man not to forget about him when he is restored to his place in Pharaoh's house. And we can only imagine the anticipation in which Joseph must have lived on that day and on the days that followed. And so we can only imagine the growing sense of despair that must have set in as those days passed. The third day comes, the cupbearer is taken out of prison, he's brought back into Pharaoh's court, he's given his job back, and the third day becomes the fourth day, and then it becomes the fifth day, and then the sixth. And then a week becomes a month, and a month becomes 2 months. And Joseph remains there. And how hard wouldn't it have been for Joseph to keep hoping? Because as those days slipped by, you can imagine Joseph in that prison cell. It becomes harder and harder to rationalize why it is that his release might have been delayed. it becomes harder and harder to accept the fact that that cupbearer for whom he had shown such compassion and care, that man had completely forgotten about him and his circumstances. Now, while Joseph was in that prison then, he must have wondered why. He must have wondered, why had God not come to his aid? Why hadn't God used that opportunity to open the prison door? Why had he allowed Joseph to be forgotten again, and to be forgotten for such a long time? He's there for 2 years. 2 years after that cupbearer is lifted up, Joseph continues to be laid low. And Joseph, surely in the midst of that prison cell, he must have cried out, why? Why, O Lord, have you done this? Why haven't you rescued me? Well, that question certainly must have rattled around in Joseph's head. But as we read Genesis 40 this morning, that question is intended to tug at our hearts as well. God is urging us to ask why. Why is it that he has treated his servant this way? Why has he acted in his life in this fashion? Well, ultimately, the answer to the question of why is because God loved him. It's because God loved Joseph that he acted in this way. And he worked in love to protect Joseph. And he is actually working in the midst of these circumstances to safeguard the security of Joseph's hope and salvation. Look, brothers and sisters, let me ask you a question. What was the threat? What was the threat that was outside of those prison cell doors? What was it? What danger threatened to assail Joseph's heart if he had been set free in the way that he anticipated being released? Wouldn't it have been the temptation to imagine that he had been set free by the goodwill and the power of men rather than by the power of God? Might not Joseph have been tempted to conclude that he had been the one to seize upon the opportunity that had presented itself? He had, after all, been the one to see the way forward out of the prison. He had been the one who knew enough about the court and about its politics and about the heart of Pharaoh to imagine that he could present himself as a useful, indeed, as a valued servant of the crown. And so the subtle but dangerous temptation of self-reliance is what lurked just outside those jailhouse doors. But God protected Joseph. He protected him by not allowing him to fall prey to the delusion that he had somehow been clever enough, that he had somehow been strong enough to participate in his own salvation. But there was actually an even greater threat that waited for Joseph's well-being outside of those prison doors if he had been released in this way. And that much greater threat was the danger of crediting Pharaoh as the one who had been responsible for setting him free. Because it would have been so easy for Joseph to have believed that it was Pharaoh's wisdom, Pharaoh's commitment to justice, Pharaoh's insight and generosity, and perhaps most of all, Pharaoh's power that had secured his freedom. And if he had come to have believed that, it wouldn't just have been disastrous for Joseph's heart. It would have been disastrous for the future of his family as well. Because here's the thing. Well, Joseph would ultimately need to live in the service of Pharaoh. He needed to be absolutely clear about the fact that Pharaoh lived in the service of the Lord. Joseph had to be absolutely convicted of the knowledge that it was God, not Pharaoh, who was in charge of the circumstances of his life. And he needed to be convicted of that, because if he wasn't convicted that God was in charge, he would not later on have been able to say to his brothers in all honesty, all the things that you had planned for evil, God had planned for good and for the salvation of his people. He needed to be able to tell his family that. And he wouldn't have been able to do that if he had believed in any way that Pharaoh had been even partly responsible for his relief. In order for that to be the case then, Joseph needed to be rendered utterly hopeless, in the sense that he had been completely stripped of any and all hope in the might of men. Joseph needed to be brought to the point where he understood that no one but God was capable of securing his freedom and restoring him to life and to fellowship with his family. Joseph had to understand that only God could open the prison door, that only God could set him free, because that was the only way for him to be set free, not just from his jail cell, but from the true prison he was in, the true prison of sin, death, and the grave. Only God can save. That is the life-saving truth that Joseph needed to be confirmed in before he could be brought up from that prison into new life and service. And as that realization, as that understanding, as it settles upon our hearts, then we're again brought to the understanding that this isn't just Joseph's story, is it? No, this is the story of the generations of Jacob. And that's a story that has its beginning in the tents of Abraham. Abraham, whom God had declared to be the father of all believers. Which means that this isn't just Joseph's story. It's our story as well. And what we learn from it is that the work that God accomplished in Joseph, it wasn't unique to him. Because being brought to the point of complete dependence on the mercy of God, well, that is something that needs to happen in the life of every single one of God's children. Look, loved ones, you and I pray that this is the case, you and I might never find ourselves confined in an Egyptian jail. But just like Joseph, we have all been held in a far more terrifying captivity. Because by nature, you and I and all of us, we are sinners. We were sinners who were born into slavery to sin and the grave. And if we are ever going to escape the confines of that imprisonment, then just like Joseph, we have got to be brought to the point of utterly despairing of any reliance on human strength or aid. We've got to be brought to the point when we have no other hope than that when everyone else has forgotten us, that God will be mindful of us, that He will remember us, that He will look upon us in all of our sin and our shame and all of our suffering and affliction, and that He will look upon us in compassion and love, and that He will do so for no other reason than that He chooses to. And that means that sometimes as He works to bring us to the point of a complete reliance on Him, that God needs to make use of the hard circumstances of our imprisonment. And He needs to make use of those circumstances as a way of bringing us to the point of casting ourselves entirely upon Him. Now that process of having our human dependencies whittled away from us, it's never an enjoyable process. It's never an easy one. But it is an absolutely necessary one. And because God loves us, He doesn't shy away from speaking the hard words that are necessary for breaking our stubborn sense of pride and self-reliance. And what that means is that sometimes God comes to us in the imprisonment of our own circumstances, and He says to us, "Not yet. Not yet." Because it's not going to be in your time. It's not going to be by means of your own cleverness. It's not going to be by means of the assistance of you or someone else that you're going to be lifted up. He comes to us sometimes and He says, "Not yet, my child, because you need to understand that it will only be by my power and in my time and according to my will that you're going to be freed from your afflictions." Now, those can be hard words to hear, but they are words that are far easier to receive today than they ever would have been for Joseph in his circumstances.
Because you think about Joseph for a minute. Joseph had those dreams. So he had the word of the Lord. He knew that he was going to be lifted up. He knew that he was going to be restored to fellowship with his family, but he had no idea how. He had no idea how it was that the Lord was going to lift him up and exalt him, but we do. We know exactly how we're going to be lifted up. And this isn't knowledge that has come to us in a dream. This is knowledge that has come to us in time. It's knowledge that has come to us in our own flesh. And we know this because we have beheld the glory of the Lord. And we have watched as the glory of the Lord has been lifted up in our place on the cross. We have seen Jesus. We've seen him lifted up on the cross. We've seen him laid in the grave. But most of all, we have seen, and note this, we have seen that after the passing of 3 days, what did he do? After the passing of 3 days, Jesus lifted himself up. After the passing of 3 days, Jesus took up the life that he had voluntarily laid down, and he stepped forth from the prison of the grave into a new and glorious life. And if we have seen that, then we have also seen how he has been lifted up in glory by his God as a mark of his acceptance and favor. And when we look upon him, when we look upon Jesus, then we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God hasn't forgotten us. Whoever you are, whatever your circumstances might be, if you are a child of the living God, you can look to the cross and you can look to Jesus Christ and you can know God hasn't forgotten me and he loves me. And we're assured that his promises to make a way from us or make a way for us, they really have been fulfilled. As we fix our gaze upon Jesus, we are assured that we don't have any reason to trust in ourselves anymore because he has done it all. He's accomplished everything. And do you know what else that we are blessed to see? What else we are blessed to understand when we look at Jesus? It's the incredible understanding that Jesus' work wasn't finished when he opened the prison door of the grave. There were other doors. And Jesus moved on from the grave to do what? To kick in the gates of hell. Those were doors that he dealt with. He walked up and he kicked those gates in. And after he had finished tearing down the strongholds and the powers of hell itself, he turned his attention and he opened a different set of doors because he opened the gates into the heavenly Jerusalem. And he opened those gates so that all of his people could be enabled to come in through them to dwell there with him in his rest. But the sure and certain message of the gospel is that only the righteous will be allowed to pass through those gates. And the righteous are those who have been led to make the good confession that there is no other way of entering in than by means of an exclusive reliance on the merits and the mediation of Jesus of Nazareth. God alone will save. That was the life-giving hope that God lovingly worked in Joseph's heart. May he graciously accomplish that same work in our hearts as well. Amen.